9%. That is the number on the Bureau of Reclamation's gauge for Butte Reservoir in southern New Mexico when water managers there gather in late 2024 to discuss what comes next. Not 9% below average, not 9% below where it was last year. 9% of capacity, total, the largest reservoir in the state of New Mexico. A body of water that at full pool stretches 40 miles long through the desert canyons of Sierra County and holds more than 2 million acre-feet of the Rio Grande's water, currently holds roughly 180,000 acre-feet. The rest is rock and air. The waterline has retreated so far from its former edges that rock formations which have not seen sunlight in decades are standing in the open, blinking in the desert light, stripped bare by a recession that did not happen all at once, but has been moving in one direction, down, for years, with only brief and insufficient interruptions. The bathtub ring at Elephant Butte is not like the famous ring at Lake Mead, which made national news when the white calcium carbonate stripe on Black Canyon became visible from the interstate. The ring at Elephant Butte is in the landscape itself, in the vegetation line where plants that took root when the water line was higher now stand exposed in dry ground, and in the pale water smoothed rock below them that marks where the reservoir surface used to be. On a topographic map, the contour lines tell the same story. The reservoir's current outline bears no resemblance to its full pool footprint. It is a shrunken remnant of the lake it was designed to be, occupying the deepest canyon portions of the basin, while the broad, flat shallows where boaters once anchored and families once swam are dry desert floor. 5 miles to the south of the reservoir sits the city of Truth or Consequences. Population approximately 5,000 people. A former spa town renamed in 1950 after a radio quiz show and one of the more unusual rebranding decisions in American civic history, built economically around the reservoir that the Elephant Butte Dam created when the Rio Grande was first impounded here in 1916. The city pumps its municipal water directly from Elephant Butte Reservoir. It has always done so. The infrastructure was designed for that source, built to that source, and maintained to that source for more than a century. The intake pipes, the pump stations, the treatment plant, the distribution network, all of it was sized and engineered for a reservoir that was expected to remain at useful operational levels, because it was fed by a river that had not yet become what the monitoring data now describes it becoming. Truth or Consequences does not have a meaningful backup. The geothermal groundwater beneath the city, the same hot springs that gave the town its original identity as a wellness destination, and that still draw visitors to the bathhouses along the main street, is mineral rich, not potable at scale, and not the water that fills the taps or runs through the municipal system. The city has some access to limited groundwater sources in the surrounding area, but they are not sufficient to replace a depleted reservoir at the volume a municipal supply system requires. They are emergency supplements, not alternatives. A backup source that can bridge a supply disruption of days or weeks is a valuable safety feature. A backup source that cannot bridge a supply disruption of months or years is, in the context of the scenario that the monitoring data describes, a comfort rather than a solution. The city's infrastructure reflects a century of planning built around the assumption that the reservoir would always be there. Not always full, the water rights and intake elevations were engineered with some contingency for low water years, but always available at a level sufficient for municipal operation. The planning assumed drought years, not aridification. It assumed that the reservoir could fall in a bad year and recover in a good one, cycling around a mean that the 20th century had defined. That mean is no longer where it was. The mean itself has shifted. And the infrastructure built for the old mean is now operating in an environment its designers did not plan for. The officials who monitor this situation are not speaking publicly in the language of emergency. They are speaking in the measured, bureaucratic vocabulary of scenario planning and contingency preparation and managed transition. But when you read the contingency documents, when you read the Bureau of Reclamation's 24-month operational studies, when you read the compact delivery accounting that tracks New Mexico's obligations to the state of Texas under an agreement signed in 1938, what you find underneath the careful language is a countdown. 3 threads run through what follows. What it actually means for a reservoir to be at 9% of capacity, and why the last 10% of a reservoir's storage is functionally worse, not just statistically worse, than any earlier 10%. The specific convergence of aridification, compact obligation, structural infrastructure failure, and backup system collapse that is driving this particular reservoir toward a threshold its designers never anticipated reaching. And the human situation, the people who depend on this water, the agricultural economy that consumes the overwhelming majority of it, and the city that sits at the bottom of the drainage with no meaningful turn to make when the water runs out, and no backup that scales to the emergency at hand. If this kind of deep, real science holds your attention, take a second to like and subscribe. It genuinely helps. The gauge does not lie. Let's begin. To understand what 9% means for a reservoir the size of Elephant Butte, you first have to understand what a reservoir's operational curve actually looks like. Because the relationship between the percentage on the gauge and the usable water remaining is not linear. It is not even close to linear. A reservoir at full capacity is not simply a large bathtub waiting to be emptied. It is a system in which the stored volume, the water pressure at the intake structures, and the gravity-fed flow capacity all depend on the depth of water above the outlets. The deeper the water, the greater the hydraulic head, the pressure that pushes water through the dam's outlet works and downstream through the pipe and canal systems that distribute it to users. When a reservoir is at 90% of capacity, the hydraulic head is nearly identical to when it was at full capacity. The water flows readily, the intake structures are submerged well below the surface, the dam's generating turbines have ample depth to operate efficiently. The system performs at design specification. As a reservoir drops, the operational picture changes in ways that are not always obvious from a simple percentage reading. Below roughly 30% of capacity, the pressure head begins to decrease noticeably. Flows become harder to sustain at designed rates. The intake structures that were built at specific elevations within the dam begin approaching their operational minimums. Engineers must begin actively managing releases in ways that were not required at higher levels, reducing flow rates. Timing releases more carefully, planning around the declining pressure available to push water through the system. Below 15%, the calculus becomes more urgent. The reservoir is now operating in a range that its designers considered a planning contingency rather than an operational norm. Dam managers carry contingency documents that were written to address this range. But in most cases, those documents were written as exercises in preparedness rather than active operational guides, because the reservoir rarely stayed here for long. A strong snow year would arrive, the inflows would surge, and the gauge would climb back toward the comfort zone. Below 10%, where Elephant Butte now sits. The system enters what hydrologists and dam engineers call the critical zone. At this level, the volume of water remaining is modest enough that each additional foot of drawdown removes a larger fraction of what is left, because the reservoir's shape narrows as it descends toward its deeper canyon-like lower sections. Think of the geometry of a wine glass versus a cylinder. The same volume of water in a wine glass drops the level much faster near the bottom than near the top, because the glass narrows. Elephant Butte's canyon-carved basin follows similar geometry. The last 10% of storage volume does not represent the last 10% of the reservoir's operational life in any straightforward sense. It represents the most compressed and most consequential portion of the operational timeline. The portion where each withdrawal matters most, where each dry month costs the most, and where the margin for error approaches zero. The concept that defines the absolute bottom of this curve is called dead pool. Dead pool is not a colloquial term. It is the formal engineering designation for the water level below which the dam's outlet works can no longer access the water remaining in the reservoir. The water is there, physically present, measurably real on a depth gauge, but it cannot be extracted through the dam's normal operational structures because it sits below the lowest intake elevation. A reservoir at dead pool still contains water. That water is simply unreachable through the infrastructure built to deliver it. It is, operationally, gone. The dead pool concept exists for every reservoir on Earth. It is a function of the specific engineering of the dam, where the intake ports are located relative to the reservoir's bottom, what the minimum operational head requirement is, and what the minimum pool elevation is that maintains structural stability in the dam's downstream face. For Elephant Butte, the Bureau of Reclamation has planning documents that address this threshold. Those documents, which were theoretical planning exercises for most of the dam's operating history, are now active planning references. At 9% of capacity in late 2024, Elephant Butte was still operating above dead pool. The intakes were still drawing. The turbines at the powerhouse were still generating, at reduced output, because the head above them had declined. Water was still being released for agricultural users and for meeting the compact obligation to Texas downstream. But the distance between 9% and the dead pool threshold is not a comfortable distance, and the direction of the gauge made the distance shorter with each passing month. At 2.2%, the level the reservoir had reached by July 2026, the word comfortable no longer applied to any operational aspect of managing this system. The story of how Elephant Butte arrived at 9% of capacity in late 2024 begins not with the immediate crisis, but with the larger system it sits within. A system that was designed in the first half of the 20th century for a river that no longer behaves the way it did when the design was made. The Rio Grande is one of the longest rivers in North America, rising in the San Juan Mountains of southern Colorado, flowing south through New Mexico's high desert and Middle Valley, reaching Elephant Butte after roughly 450 miles of descent from its source watershed. It is fed by snowmelt. The mountains of southern Colorado and northern New Mexico receive the winter snowpack that, when it melts in the spring and early summer, becomes the Rio Grande's primary annual flow. That flow is highly variable. Good snow years can bring strong spring pulses that partially replenish reservoirs along the river. Dry years deliver thin trickles that cannot compensate for the demands being placed on the system simultaneously. The Elephant Butte Dam was proposed, planned and built under the auspices of the newly created Bureau of Reclamation in the first decade of the 20th century. A period of extraordinary hydraulic ambition in the American West, when the federal government was actively transforming arid landscapes into productive farmland through the construction of dams, canals, and irrigation systems that would have seemed impossible a generation earlier. The dam was completed in 1916 after 5 years of construction, becoming the largest dam in the world at the time of its completion, impounding the Rio Grande behind 301 feet of concrete and creating a reservoir that, at its maximum designed capacity, stretched 40 miles into the desert canyon country of Sierra County. The reservoir it created was, for a brief period in the 1940s, the largest artificial lake on Earth by surface area. The Rio Grande Compact of 1938 formalized how the river's water is divided among Colorado, New Mexico, and Texas. Under the compact, New Mexico is obligated to deliver a specified amount of water to Elephant Butte Reservoir each year. Water that is then managed by the Bureau of Reclamation and released to the Elephant Butte and El Paso Valley irrigation districts downstream. Texas receives its share under the compact through those downstream deliveries. The compact was written for a river that its authors had measured for several decades and believed they understood. It was written, like the Colorado River Compact 16 years earlier, in a parallel act of well-intentioned overcommitment, during an era when the historical record of the river ran somewhat above its long-term average, and the compact's allocations reflected that temporary generosity rather than the river's actual long-term mean. The compact established legal obligations that do not flex with drought. New Mexico must deliver what the compact requires, regardless of what the Rio Grande is actually carrying in any given year. When New Mexico falls short of its delivery obligation, as it did in 2025, when the state was approximately 39,000 acre-feet short of what the compact required, the deficit accumulates, and it must eventually be made up from the reservoir's storage. The compact is both a water allocation agreement and a delivery schedule, and it sits in tension with a river that is producing less water per year than when the delivery schedule was written. The law says deliver a fixed amount. The river delivers what the watershed provides. In dry years, those two statements cannot both be true simultaneously. One of them gives way, and in the water law of the American West, it is almost never the compact. When Elephant Butte Reservoir last approached full capacity, it was the 1980s and early 1990s. The reservoir stayed near capacity through much of that decade, fed by generous snowpack years in southern Colorado and northern New Mexico that stacked water into the system faster than agriculture and downstream obligations could draw it down. Aerial photographs from those years show a vast expanse of blue water reflecting the desert sky, marina docks floating at high water elevation. The butte for which the reservoir is named barely visible above the waterline. Recreation facilities built at the reservoir's edge were fully operational. The area around Elephant Butte was a regional destination. Boating, fishing, camping on the shore of a body of water that felt, in those years, permanent. That era is the benchmark against which current managers measure the current loss, and the comparison is staggering. From near full pool to 9%, a drawdown of roughly 1.9 million acre-feet in the span of roughly 3 decades of accelerating decline. The decline was not steady. It moved in fits and starts, with wet years providing partial recovery and dry years pushing the gauge to new lows. But the overall direction never reversed. Each multi-year dry period ended at a lower average than the previous one, and each subsequent wet period recovered less than the prior one. The system was not oscillating around a stable mean. It was trending down while oscillating, and the oscillation masked the trend until the trend became undeniable. The reservoir has been low before. In 1954, during the most severe drought of the 20th century in the southwestern United States, Elephant Butte fell to approximately 13,000 acre-feet, roughly half of 1% of its capacity. That historical minimum is the comparison that local water managers invoke when they want to provide perspective, because it demonstrates that the system has approached zero before and recovered when precipitation patterns eventually improved. The 1950s drought ended. Wet years returned. The reservoir refilled. The system demonstrated that it could survive near total depletion and return to normal function within a few years of the drought's peak. This is the history that provides comfort. But the 1954 event and the current crisis differ in one specific way that the storage percentage alone does not capture. The 1954 low occurred in a climate that was still on its long-term average. The climate that the dam's designers had measured and planned for. The drought was a temporary departure below that average. When the average reasserted itself, the drought ended and the reservoir recovered. The current crisis is occurring in a climate whose average has shifted. The wet years still come. They just don't refill the system the way they used to, because the warmer atmosphere consumes more of each precipitation event before it becomes river flow and reservoir storage. The question that researchers studying the current trajectory are forcing into the policy conversation is whether this time is different, not just worse, but categorically different in a way that changes what recovery means, and whether it will come on the timescale that the communities depending on this water need it to. The evidence from the monitoring data, the snowpack trend lines, the streamflow records, and the atmospheric reanalysis products that track what the climate over the Rio Grande watershed has been doing across the past 3 decades all point in the same direction. The evidence is not unanimous on the specific magnitude of the future change. It is unanimous on the direction. Here is what the monitoring data shows, stripped of the institutional caution that tends to soften its presentation in public-facing documents. The year 2025 was devastating. The Rio Grande's measured flow in 2025 ran more than 50% below the historical average. Not 50% below a recent average, but 50% below the long-term mean that compact obligations and water right allocations were built around. The riverbed between Albuquerque and Elephant Butte ran dry through the summer months, not at a specific confined location, but across more than 50 miles of the river's middle reach. A river that has flowed continuously through human civilization in the Southwest ran dry for an extended period between 2 of New Mexico's major population centers. The sand was visible in the channel. People walked in the riverbed. Water that was supposed to be flowing south to fill a reservoir that was already critically low was instead disappearing into the atmosphere and the dry riverbed sediment before it could complete its journey. The San Juan Chama project is the backup system that New Mexico created specifically to supplement Rio Grande flows during dry periods. It is an engineering project that diverts water from the Colorado River Basin in southwestern Colorado, tunnels it under the Continental Divide at elevations above 11,000 feet, and releases it into the Rio Chama, a tributary of the Rio Grande in northern New Mexico. It was designed to give New Mexico additional water supply that is independent of the native Rio Grande snowpack. providing a second source of inflow that could partially compensate for years when Rio Grande flows were deficient. The project has functioned as designed for decades, providing meaningful supplemental supply during drought years. In 2025, the San Juan Chama project's allocation fell to a record low, down 69% from a full supply year. The backup ran dry in the same year as the river it was built to supplement. Both systems failed simultaneously, in the same direction by record margins, in the same season. By late 2025, New Mexico's accounting under the Rio Grande Compact showed the state running approximately 39,000 acre-feet short of its delivery obligations to downstream water users, obligations that, under the Compact's framework, must eventually be made up from storage, from future inflows, or from reductions in allocations to New Mexico's own water users. The deficit was real, legally meaningful, and accumulating. In November 2025, Bureau of Reclamation water managers attempted to make up a portion of the deficit through a block release of stored water in the upper system. Releasing water from upstream reservoirs and directing it down the Rio Grande toward Elephant Butte. Water released from the Coquiti Reservoir above Albuquerque flowed southward. By the time it reached the reaches below Albuquerque, it had been substantially absorbed by the dry riverbed, drunk by the thirsty sand, evaporated into dry air, taken up by the vegetation along the riparian corridor. The block release that left Cochiti did not arrive at Elephant Butte in anything close to the volume that departed. The losing reaches of the Rio Grande consumed the water before it could be stored. The mechanism driving this decline runs deeper than precipitation variability. It operates through the same dynamics that the American West's broader water crisis reflects. And understanding it requires looking at what actually feeds Elephant Butte, not just the rain gauge above the dam, but the entire watershed that channels water toward the Rio Grande. The Rio Grande's flow originates in snowpack. Specifically, in the snowpack accumulation across the San Juan Mountains of southern Colorado, the Sangre de Cristo Range of northern New Mexico, and the associated high-elevation terrain that sheds its winter snow across the spring months as temperatures rise. That snowpack is declining, not in every year, not uniformly, but in a documented structural trend that is driven by rising temperatures at the elevation bands where snow accumulates and melts. Temperature matters in two distinct ways in a snow-fed watershed. The first is at the accumulation stage. Warmer winters mean that precipitation that used to fall as snow at middle elevations now falls as rain. Rain does not hold. It runs off quickly, does not build a snowpack bank, and does not deliver the slow-release spring melt that has historically fed the Rio Grande through the critical irrigation season. The second way temperature matters is at the consumption stage, a warmer landscape, with warmer soils and more stressed vegetation drawing harder on whatever moisture remains, takes a larger fraction of each precipitation event into evapotranspiration. The combined loss of water to evaporation from soil surfaces and transpiration through plant leaves before that water can reach a stream channel and eventually the river. The result is what hydrologists describe as stream flow reduction that is disproportionate to the precipitation decline. The Rio Grande is producing less water per unit of rainfall and snowfall than it did 2 or 3 decades ago, because the atmosphere over its watershed is warmer and therefore consumes more of each precipitation event before it can become runoff. The river is receiving somewhat less precipitation in dry years. but it is also producing substantially less stream flow per unit of precipitation in all years. Both factors are operating simultaneously, and they compound each other in the same direction, down. Here is the part that the mainstream public conversation about southwestern drought still tends to understate. A reservoir like Elephant Butte is not just a storage tank waiting to be refilled by the next wet year. It is a balancing account between inflows and outflows, and the inflow side of the account is structurally smaller than it was when the account was opened. A wet year in a warming watershed does not refill the reservoir the way the same precipitation total would have refilled it in 1980 or 1990. Because the warmer atmosphere consumes a larger fraction of that precipitation before it becomes river flow. The same number of inches of snowpack now produces fewer acre-feet of reservoir storage. The reservoir is not draining faster than before. The outflow obligations have not dramatically increased. The reservoir is refilling slower than before. Because the watershed that feeds it is drier between precipitation events, warmer in the seasons when snow should accumulate, and more aggressive at consuming moisture before it can run off into a channel. This is aridification, not drought. A drought is temporary. It ends. Aridification is a directional shift in the water balance of a region. The 1950s drought ended because the atmospheric circulation patterns that had suppressed precipitation eventually shifted back. Aridification does not end when a wet year arrives. It continues beneath the wet year, suppressing the recovery that the wet year would otherwise provide, ensuring that each recovery starts from a lower baseline than the one before. Research published by New Mexico's Bureau of Geology and Mineral Resources projected that the state would face a 25% reduction in renewable surface water and groundwater supply by 2070. Water managers reviewing that projection against the 2025 data, a year when the shortfall exceeded 50%, now view the 2070 timeline as optimistic. The crisis being planned for is not a 50-year horizon. It is the immediate operational reality of reservoirs at 2% and rivers that ran dry through the summer. A Bureau of Reclamation official, speaking in a May 2026 interview with New Mexico Public Media, projected that Elephant Butte would likely reach 2% of capacity by August. The gauge monitoring service for the reservoir confirmed it. By mid-July 2026, Elephant Butte was at approximately 2.2% of capacity, roughly 48,000 acre-feet. In a reservoir designed to hold more than 2 million, 48,000 acre-feet is a number that stops conversations in the offices of water managers who have spent careers working with this system. The official described it in terms that her institution's public communications rarely use: 3 consecutive bad years. 2024 was not a good flow year. 2025 was not. 2026 was not. A reservoir system that can carry a region through a bad year or two is being asked to carry it through a 3rd consecutive deficit on a storage base that is nearly gone. The agricultural economy of the Elephant Butte system dwarfs the municipal water use of Truth or Consequences. The Elephant Butte Irrigation District serves farmers across the Mesilla Valley. The stretch of the Rio Grande Valley between Truth or Consequences and El Paso that has produced cotton, pecans, chiles, and onions for more than a century under the irrigation water made available by the Bureau of Reclamation's Rio Grande project. The EBID serves tens of thousands of irrigated acres, and the families, businesses, and small towns built around those irrigated acres represent the majority of the economic activity in Sierra, Doña Ana, and adjacent counties. The Mesilla Valley's agricultural economy is not a marginal or peripheral feature of the regional picture. It is the regional picture. It is what the infrastructure was built to support, and what the compact was written to sustain. When Elephant Butte's storage falls below the level needed to supply a normal irrigation season, the EBID begins allocating its reduced supply across its water users, and the allocations reflect the math of scarcity. In recent years, farmers who had historically received a full season's surface water allocation have received fractions of that allocation, or no allocation at all in some seasons. The response has been immediate and predictable increased groundwater pumping. When surface water is unavailable, the wells run. This is not an informal workaround. It is a formally acknowledged operational reality in the Elephant Butte Irrigation District's own planning documents and in the Bureau of Reclamation's analysis of the Rio Grande project's water supply situation. The consequence of this response is a second, slower crisis running beneath the surface crisis. The groundwater beneath the Mesilla Valley, the Mesilla Aquifer, has been absorbing the consequences of the surface water decline through exactly this mechanism. As surface water becomes unavailable, groundwater pumps more. As groundwater pumps more, the water table drops. As the water table drops, the cost of extraction rises, the depth to water increases, and the efficiency of the system diminishes. The groundwater that was the operational backup to the surface water is declining, and the rate of decline accelerates as the surface water situation worsens. The backup is being consumed by the emergency it was meant to address. This is the same pattern documented at scale across the American West, Lake Mead and the Colorado River above, the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta and its sinking peat islands, the High Plains Ogallala Aquifer beneath the Kansas and Texas panhandles. Surface water scarcity drives groundwater pumping. Groundwater pumping draws down the aquifer. The aquifer's decline makes surface water scarcity worse, because the groundwater that used to seep into stream channels and maintain river base flows is no longer at the level required to reach those channels. The two crises feed each other. The system heads toward a state in which neither surface water nor groundwater is adequate to sustain the demand structure built around both. Josh Smith, the general manager of the Elephant Butte Irrigation District, stated publicly in July 2026 that the primary concern was whether the water situation changes. The primary concern is that if our water situation doesn't change, and we don't receive snowpack in Colorado and northern New Mexico and get flows, we're going to have big problems, he said. The formulation is careful, measured, appropriate to a public official speaking about an ongoing crisis. The implication for the farmers he represents, for the families that have grown pecans and chiles in the Mesilla Valley for generations, for the businesses that process and distribute their crops, for the communities that exist because that agricultural economy exists, is starker than the careful phrasing conveys. New Mexico's state legislature representative from the Truth or Consequences area, writing in a May 2026 public commentary, described the situation in terms that went further than the usual official vocabulary. After this irrigation season, our surface water system is effectively fully committed. Agricultural deliveries are shrinking. Obligations downstream to El Paso and Mexico continue. And meaningful reserves are disappearing. The system is no longer operating with margin because it is now functioning at its limit. Her conclusion was pointed. We are not running out of water entirely, but we are running out of easy water. That phrase, running out of easy water, is the most accurate short description of what is happening to the communities that depend on Elephant Butte. The hard water remains, the groundwater that can still be drilled to at increasing depth and increasing cost, the recycled municipal effluent that can be treated and returned to supply, the water conservation that can be extracted from current patterns of use by changing behavior. All of these options exist. None of them are as easy as the river water that filled the reservoir in the 1980s. None of them are as cheap, as reliable, or as scalable on the timeline the crisis is imposing. The easy water is gone. What remains requires investment, infrastructure, changed behavior, and time is the resource in shortest supply. Truth or Consequences sits at the bottom of this system, 5 miles south of the reservoir, and it occupies a particular position in the water rights hierarchy that does not insulate it from shortage. The city's municipal water right draws from the reservoir at a specific allocation, and that allocation is subject to the same operational constraints that govern the entire Rio Grande project's distribution. When the reservoir level falls to the point that maintaining municipal intake becomes an engineering challenge, when the city's pump infrastructure is drawing from water that is measurably close to dead pool, the city must begin making decisions it has not previously been required to make. Those decisions involve a population of roughly 5,000 people who have lived for generations with the assumption that when they turn on the tap, water comes out. For those residents, the retirees who moved here for the hot springs and the quiet, the families who have lived here for multiple generations, the small business owners whose establishments exist because this is a community of 5,000 people with water. The contingency scenario is not abstract. It is the question of where they live and how they live, and whether the infrastructure they rely on will continue to function. The options available to Truth or Consequences in a scenario where the reservoir approaches operational minimum are not abundant. Emergency groundwater wells can be drilled and brought online, but the geothermal nature of the city's underlying geology creates water quality challenges. The minerals dissolved into the groundwater by contact with volcanic rock beneath the city make treatment expensive, and, at larger volumes, technically demanding. The famous hot springs that are the city's identity and its tourism draw are a manifestation of the same geothermal system that makes its groundwater complicated. The thing that makes Truth or Consequences unique as a place is also the thing that makes its emergency water supply options more constrained than those of a city sitting above a simple clean aquifer. Trucking water is possible as a short-term emergency measure and has been used by small communities in crisis situations across the American West. But trucking water at the scale of a municipal system serving 5,000 people on an ongoing basis is a cost and logistics problem of a fundamentally different order than keeping an emergency supply going for a few days during a pipe repair. The state of New Mexico has a 50-year water plan. It includes provisions for water recycling, aquifer recharge, infrastructure investment, and demand reduction. The plan is genuine. It represents serious, expert thinking about the long-term water future of a state that is among the most water-stressed in the country. The plan's timeline is 50 years. The reservoir's trajectory at current rates of decline does not extend to 50 years. It may not extend to 5. Internationally, the situation at Elephant Butte has been watched by water managers in countries that have already experienced what the United States water-stressed regions are approaching. Cape Town, South Africa, in 2018, came within weeks of reaching what officials there called Day Zero, the day when the city's reservoir system would fall below the level needed to supply municipal taps. forcing the population of 4 million people to collect water from distribution points around the city rather than accessing it through the municipal system. The approach to Day Zero was one of the most closely documented urban water crises in modern history, precisely because Cape Town had good data, good monitoring, and a transparent public communication strategy that gave the world a view into every stage of the crisis as it approached. Cape Town avoided Day Zero through a combination of aggressive emergency conservation, mandatory restrictions that reduced per capita consumption to levels most Western consumers would find extraordinary, reduced agricultural allocations to the farms surrounding the city, emergency desalination and groundwater drilling that added new supply, and, ultimately, a winter rainy season that provided enough inflow to pull the reservoir system back from the critical threshold. The crisis was averted, but it left the city permanently changed in its relationship to water, its infrastructure, and its public understanding of the precarity of urban water supply in a drought-stressed environment. Cape Town has been more resilient since Day Zero, not because it received more rain, but because it restructured its relationship to the water it receives. Truth or Consequences is not Cape Town. It is smaller by several orders of magnitude. In a different climate system, with different emergency resources and a different institutional context. But the structural parallel between Cape Town in 2017-2018 and the communities around Elephant Butte in 2025-2026 is precise in the ways that matter most. A municipal water supply with primary dependence on a surface reservoir. A long-term precipitation trend moving in the wrong direction. A reservoir approaching critical operational thresholds after multiple consecutive drought years. An institutional response that is serious in intent, but has not yet produced the investment and infrastructure transition that would actually solve the problem before the problem solves itself by running out. The difference is that Cape Town had 4 million residents and a global platform. The crisis generated international news coverage for months, attracted the attention of water managers on every continent, and produced a body of research and policy analysis that is now cited in urban water planning documents across the developing world. Truth or Consequences has 5,000 residents and a local profile. The crisis is documented in Bureau of Reclamation operational studies, in compact accounting tables, in agricultural district reports, and in the occasional regional news coverage that reaches beyond the immediate area. The global platform is not there. The water crisis is. The Texas v. New Mexico lawsuit, which Texas filed in 2013, arguing that New Mexico groundwater pumping in the stretch between Elephant Butte and the Texas state line was intercepting water owed to Texas under the Rio Grande Compact. Settled in 2026 under a consent decree that resolved the legal dispute between the states. The settlement represents a genuine institutional achievement. Years of Supreme Court-level litigation between two states over water rights is a major undertaking to resolve, and the settlement provides legal clarity about the framework within which the water that does exist will be divided. But the settlement resolves who is legally entitled to the water that is available. It does not create water that the weather has not delivered. A consent decree that clarifies the sharing of a declining resource does not enlarge the resource. It clarifies who receives less. The rechanneling project that the Bureau of Reclamation is planning for a stretch of the Rio Grande above Elephant Butte, realigning the river channel through the San Acacia Reach where sediment buildup has raised the riverbed above the surrounding valley floor, reducing the efficiency of water transport to the reservoir, is a genuine engineering intervention that could add meaningful water to the system. Preliminary studies suggest it could deliver 10,000 or more additional acre-feet per year to Elephant Butte under favorable flow conditions. In a reservoir that holds more than 2 million acre-feet when full, 10,000 acre-feet sounds modest. In a reservoir holding 48,000 acre-feet, 10,000 additional acre-feet represents a 20% increase in storage. Every acre-foot matters in this portion of the operational curve, but the rechanneling will not resolve the fundamental deficit. The Bureau of Reclamation's own framing was careful on this point. The project will help move the water that exists more efficiently. It will not produce water that the snowpack did not provide. It is a better pipe, not a new well. And as the region's atmospheric conditions continue shifting in the direction that the monitoring data describes, the question of efficiency in delivering existing water becomes secondary to the question of how much water the watershed will provide at all. What the science can see at Elephant Butte and across the Rio Grande watershed is the full extent of the current crisis and the trend lines that produced it. The Bureau of Reclamation maintains continuous storage monitoring at Elephant Butte, reporting daily measurements to the national databases that hydrologists, farmers, city planners, and journalists consult. The USGs maintain stream gauge networks across the Rio Grande and its tributaries, tracking flow at hundreds of points in real time and building the long-term record against which current flows are compared. NOAA's Climate Prediction Center issues seasonal outlooks for the Southwest that translate atmospheric conditions into probability statements about precipitation deficits or surpluses for the coming months. The National Integrated Drought Information System synthesizes soil moisture, stream flow, precipitation anomaly, and groundwater data into the composite drought monitor that documents the severity and geographic extent of current drought conditions across the country. All of these systems are operational. All of them are watching the same thing. The data is not hidden. The trend it shows is not ambiguous. What the science cannot tell the city of truth or consequences with precision is the year the taps stop. It cannot do so because the remaining water at Elephant Butte, and whatever additional water may flow into the reservoir from Colorado's snowpack over the next several years, and the rate at which agricultural and municipal withdrawals occur. All interact in ways that make the specific endpoint sensitive to variables that remain genuinely uncertain. A strong La Niña winter could deliver above normal snowpack to the San Juan Mountains and add tens of thousands of acre-feet to the reservoir. A second consecutive poor snow year could drop Elephant Butte to historical minimums not seen since 1954. The trajectory is clear. The precise date of arrival at the bottom is not. That uncertainty, the gap between knowing the direction and knowing the specific moment of crisis, is both the most honest scientific statement about the situation and the most operationally inconvenient one. Emergency investment, infrastructure construction, and the political will to make painful decisions about water allocation all require a sufficiently urgent timeline to generate action. A crisis that is clearly approaching but cannot be precisely dated is a difficult thing for democratic institutions and investment cycles to respond to at the speed the approaching crisis warrants. The contingency plans are drafted. The planning documents exist. The funding required to execute the most expensive of the alternatives, large-scale water recycling infrastructure, desalination capacity, interbasin transfers from more water-abundant regions, has not materialized at the scale the situation requires. The institutional challenge is not unique to New Mexico. Every Western water manager is navigating the same gap between the scientific picture which is clear and alarming, and the institutional response, which has been serious but not commensurate. The water law of the American West was built for a different set of hydrological conditions and has not been structurally reformed at the speed the changing conditions require. The water rights established under prior appropriation doctrine, first in time, first in right, create a legal framework in which reducing allocations, even allocations that the physical system can no longer fulfill, requires either voluntary transaction or formal legal process. Neither happens at the speed of a reservoir dropping 1 percentage point per month. The reservoir was at 9% of capacity when the water managers gathered in late 2024. By summer 2025, it fell to 3%. By mid-2026, it is at 2.2%. The direction has not changed. The gauge is still counting down. The Elephant Butte Dam was completed in 1916 after 5 years of construction, becoming the largest dam in the world at the time it was finished. The reservoir it created transformed southern New Mexico's agricultural economy, turned a dry stretch of river valley into productive farmland, and created the conditions for human settlement at a scale that the native flow of the Rio Grande could never have supported, unmodified. It was one of the great infrastructure achievements of the American West's development era, and it worked as designed for most of a century. The assumption embedded in its design, in the allocation decisions made under the Rio Grande Compact of 1938, in the irrigation district boundaries drawn across the Mesilla Valley, in the municipal infrastructure built to pump from its surface, was that the Rio Grande would continue to deliver the flow volumes that the early 20th century had measured. It was not an unreasonable assumption in 1916 or in 1938. The river was producing what the record showed it had produced. The 20th century was, in the long view of the Rio Grande's history, a relatively wet period that made the river seem more reliable than its geological and paleoclimate past had been. The document that sits in water managers' offices now. Tracking the daily measurement at the gauge and running the arithmetic forward is a planning document for what happens when the water runs out, not whether it might run out, what happens when it does. The contingency protocols have been drafted. The emergency scenarios have been modeled. The Bureau of Reclamation has considered what it means to manage Elephant Butte in its final operational range, and has begun accounting for the specific engineering choices that range requires. This is what institutional preparation looks like at its most serious. It is real, it is professional, and it is happening at a pace that reflects the urgency on the gauge. It is also, by definition, preparation for a scenario that the institutions are now treating as a planning baseline rather than an extreme contingency, which is itself a statement about how the situation has changed. What it cannot do is change the number on the gauge. The Rio Grande ran dry in the summer of 2025 for 50 miles between Albuquerque and the reservoir that is supposed to hold what the river carries. The riverbed was sand and rock in the place where a river is supposed to be. The reservoir held 2.2% of the water it was built to hold by mid-July 2026. The cities, farms, and communities between Truth or Consequences and El Paso that depend on what comes out of Elephant Butte Dam are making plans that would have seemed implausible 20 years ago. There is a word in Western water management that marks the shift from planning to crisis: curtailment. Curtailment is the formal reduction of water rights. The legal mechanism by which a water authority tells a rights holder that the water they have a legal entitlement to deliver will not, in fact, be delivered this season. Curtailment is not failure. It is the managed acknowledgement that the water that is legally committed does not physically exist in the volume that the legal commitment assumed. It is the prior appropriation doctrine meeting aridification, in a conversation neither was designed to have. The communities of southern New Mexico are living in the space between the last of the easy water and the first of the hard decisions. The reservoir is at 2.2% and declining. The river that feeds it was dry for 50 miles last summer. The backup system, the San Juan Chama Project's Colorado River diversions, hit record low allocations in 2025. The compact obligations to Texas have been partially met through a consent decree that resolved the legal dispute while leaving the physical problem unchanged. The hard decisions look like this. A farmer in the Mesilla Valley who has irrigated the same fields for 3 generations is told that his surface water allocation for the coming irrigation season is 0, and that the groundwater he can pump as a substitute is subject to new restrictions because the aquifer beneath the valley is declining. A business in Truth or Consequences that depends on municipal water supply is told that the city is implementing tiered conservation restrictions that limit high-volume uses. A water rights holder who has a legal entitlement to a specific volume of Rio Grande water discovers that the legal entitlement and the physical availability have diverged to a degree that the entitlement document does not address. These are not future scenarios. They are descriptions of conditions that are already developing across the system, in degrees that will intensify as the reservoir continues its decline. The gauge at Elephant Butte reads 2.2%. The planning documents are written. The countdown does not have an official end date because no one can give it one with scientific certainty. But in a reservoir at 2.2% of capacity, the certainty that is missing is not about the direction. It is only about the hour.